The afternoon light fell softly through the half-drawn curtains, settling in thin golden lines across the wooden floor. Dust moved lazily in the air, as if even it understood that the room belonged to a man who no longer rushed. He sat by the window, hands folded, shoulders slightly curved, not from weakness, but from years. 82 of them. A full lifetime. Long enough to build a name. Long enough to lose friends. Long enough to bury pride. And sometimes, long enough to finally speak. He did not begin with a grand announcement. There were no microphones pushed into his face, no dramatic headlines waiting to be written. Just a quiet breath. A pause that stretched a little longer than necessary. The kind of pause that tells you something important is standing at the edge of being said. John Kani has always been a man who measured his words. People know his voice, steady, deliberate, carrying weight without shouting. But that afternoon, there was something different in the way he leaned forward, fingers brushing the arm of the chair as if testing whether the memory would hold. 82 years. Think about that. 8 decades of living in public light and private shadow. There are things a man learns to carry without complaint. There are feelings he tucks away because the world is not always ready to hear them, or because he himself is not ready to admit them. And then there is her name. He did not say it immediately. He let it hover, as though even now, after all this time, speaking it aloud required negotiation with his own heart. Mandy Kani. For years he had spoken of many things, work, struggle, art, dignity. But about her? He had chosen silence. Not because there was nothing to say, quite the opposite. Silence, in his case, had been a form of protection. Of whom exactly is harder to tell. Her? Himself? Or the fragile space between memory and regret? He smiled when he finally mentioned her, but it wasn't the bright smile of celebration. It was quieter, almost startled, as if he too was surprised that the feeling was still alive. I kept it to myself, he admitted. Not dramatically, not defensively, just plainly, the way an old man might confess to having hidden letters in a drawer for decades. What had he kept? Admiration? Love? Resentment? Gratitude? He did not label it. That was the unsettling part. He spoke in fragments, about moments that seemed ordinary at the time, a conversation that lingered too long, a look that lasted a second more than it should have, about the way she would listen without interrupting, about how she once challenged him, quietly but firmly, when no one else dared. He described her laughter, not loudly, but like someone remembering the sound of rain after a long drought. It had stayed with him, through years, through distance, through everything. Why now? Why wait until 82? He leaned back, eyes narrowing slightly, as though he could see the past unfolding on the wall opposite him. Because you think you have time, he said, until you realize time has been the one thing you never owned. There was no accusation in his voice, only recognition. For decades, he had chosen restraint. Perhaps he believed speaking would complicate lives. Perhaps he feared misunderstanding. Or perhaps he simply did what many men of his generation did, swallow emotions whole and call it strength. But age does something strange. It loosens the grip of pride. It makes you less concerned with how you are perceived and more concerned with what remains unsaid. He admitted that there were nights when he thought of reaching out, not to change anything, just to acknowledge what had been there. But he didn't. I told myself it wasn't necessary, he murmured, almost amused at his younger self's certainty. There was a slight tremor in his hand when he spoke next. Not weakness, but intensity. He spoke about regret, without naming it regret. About how certain connections shape you even if they never fully become what they could have been. about how some people enter your life not to stay forever, but to alter the way you see yourself. And then, unexpectedly, he laughed. Softly. "I thought silence was dignified," he said. "Now, I'm not so sure." The room felt smaller at that moment, more intimate, as if the walls themselves were listening. He did not claim tragedy. He did not describe a grand, forbidden romance. What made his confession startling was its restraint, the realization that something profound had lived quietly alongside his public life for years, unnoticed by those who thought they knew him best. There was tenderness in his voice when he said her name again. Not possession, not longing, something more complicated, a mixture of gratitude and unfinished conversation. "Some truths," he said slowly, "don't disappear just because you refuse to speak them." 82 years, a lifetime of discipline, of carefully constructed narratives. And yet here he was, in a sunlit room, admitting that one of the most powerful emotions of his life had been the one he never allowed into the light. Outside, the afternoon continued, as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. Cars passed. A bird landed briefly on the windowsill and flew away. Ordinary movements in an ordinary world. But inside that room, something had shifted. He had opened a door long kept closed, not dramatically, not for spectacle, simply because, at this age, there is little left to protect, except honesty. And as he fell quiet again, gaze resting somewhere beyond the glass, one question lingered heavier than the rest. What might have changed if he had spoken sooner? If you step back from the quiet room and rewind the years, the story between John and Mandy does not begin with headlines or applause. It begins in smaller spaces, in borrowed rooms, in uncertain seasons, in conversations that lasted longer than the electricity in the building. Yes, she was his wife, his partner. But those words feel too neat, too official. What they had was not built in ceremony. It was built in survival. Long before the world attached titles to his name, before audiences rose to their feet, before critics debated his brilliance, there was a different kind of stage. One without lights. One where the stakes were rent, dignity, and endurance. And in that narrow, unforgiving space, Mandy stood beside him. Not in front, not behind. Beside. She was never drawn to the spotlight. In fact, she avoided it. While others chased recognition, she chose distance. She preferred kitchens over premieres, quiet over spectacle. Not because she lacked presence, but because she understood something deeper. Fame is loud, but stability is quiet. There were years when work was uncertain, years when belief had to stretch further than money. He would leave home carrying scripts, ideas, conviction. She would stay behind carrying something heavier, the responsibility of keeping everything intact. It is easy to romanticize struggle in hindsight, to say, "We were strong." But strength is rarely glamorous in real time. It looks like unpaid bills stacked discreetly in a drawer. It sounds like whispered arguments at midnight. It feels like doubt pressing at the edges of love. Through those years, she did not complain publicly. She did not posture. She did not remind him of what she sacrificed. That, perhaps, is why her role remained invisible to the world. When recognition finally came, slow at first, then suddenly, something shifted. People began to speak his name with admiration. Invitations multiplied. Applause became familiar. But fame has a peculiar side effect. It isolates. The world sees the man on stage. It does not see the person who steadies him before he steps into the light. Mandy never chased interviews. She did not correct narratives. She did not insist on being acknowledged. If anything, She seemed almost relieved to remain unnamed in the story others were eager to tell. And yet, behind every public triumph, there was her quiet architecture. The steadying conversations, the firm reminders of who he was before the world started applauding, the grounding presence when praise threatened to distort perspective. He once admitted, though rarely, that success can seduce, not just financially, but emotionally. It whispers that you are singular, self-made, invincible. But at home, in the dim kitchen light, none of that mattered. There, he was simply a husband, a man expected to wash dishes, a man reminded that talent does not excuse neglect. She was not impressed by applause. That might have been her greatest gift. While others celebrated the rise, she measured the cost. Long nights away, missed family moments, the invisible tax that ambition collects from those closest to it. And still, she stayed. Not as a shadow, not as an accessory, but as an anchor. There were moments, he hinted at this carefully, when tension grew. Not dramatic betrayal, not scandal, just the slow friction of two strong people navigating a life that kept expanding beyond the size they had once imagined. He would return from stages where hundreds listened to him, only to sit across from her at a small table where she asked harder questions than any journalist ever had. "Are you still the same man?" she once asked him quietly, according to his memory. It unsettled him more than any criticism ever could, because she was the only one who remembered him before the applause shaped his posture. She did not belong to the theater world. She did not crave artistic circles or industry praise. Her universe was built differently. Family, steadiness, principle. While he spoke of art and legacy, she spoke of responsibility and consistency. Some might say that difference creates distance. In their case, it created tension and balance. He needed someone unimpressed by his reputation. She needed someone who respected her refusal to be dazzled. And through decades, through political shifts, through personal evolution, through aging, they held that line. When the spotlight intensified, she did not step into it. She adjusted the curtains at home. When critics debated his performances, she commented on his exhaustion. When people congratulated him on awards, she asked whether he had eaten. There is something almost shocking in that simplicity. Because for all the grand narratives built around his public life, the foundation was laid in a much quieter space. A space where Mandy ensured that he did not drift too far into his own mythology. He said once, in that slow, reflective tone of his, that without her, success might have swallowed him whole. And perhaps that is the most revealing detail of all. Mandy was not a woman of headlines. She was not photographed beside him on every red carpet. She was rarely quoted, rarely analyzed, rarely celebrated. But she was the one who held the structure together when no one was looking. And now, at 82, as he speaks of emotions long withheld, you begin to understand why her name carries such weight in his voice. Because some partnerships are not defined by public display. They are defined by who remains standing next to you when the applause fades, and who quietly ensures you never lose your balance in the first place. Silence did not fall over his marriage overnight. It grew the way moss grows on stone, slow, unnoticed, almost natural. At first, it looked like discipline. Then, it looked like strength. Eventually, it simply became habit. John belonged to a generation of men who were taught that love was proven through provision, not confession. You worked. You endured. You did not narrate your feelings like pages in a diary. You did not pause to explain tenderness. If you loved someone, you stayed. That was enough. Or so they believed. He once said, almost apologetically, "We didn't grow up saying those words." And he meant it. In his world, vulnerability could be mistaken for weakness. A man showed commitment by carrying burdens not by speaking about them. So he carried everything. Work consumed him. Not just the performances, but the causes, the conversations, the expectations placed on him as a public figure. There were responsibilities that felt larger than personal emotion. A country shifting, an industry demanding, a community watching. Where, in all of that, was there space to sit down and say, "Thank you for holding me up"? Gratitude often remained implied. He assumed she knew. Assumed she understood that every step forward he took carried her fingerprints. But assumption is a fragile substitute for articulation. He admitted, with a faint shake of his head, that there were nights when she looked at him as if waiting for something more than silence, something warmer, something explicit, and he would respond with practicalities. "Did you eat? Are the children asleep? I have rehearsal early tomorrow." Useful sentences, necessary sentences, but not the ones she might have needed. The irony is painful when you think about it. A man capable of moving audiences with layered emotions struggled to offer the simplest words at home. He spoke publicly about injustice, about dignity, about the power of truth. But privately, he rarely said, "I'm grateful for you." Rarely said, "I couldn't have done this without you." Rarely admitted, "I'm afraid of losing you." Part of it was pride, not arrogance, just the quiet ego of a man who believed he must remain composed. Part of it was fear, because once you open the door to tenderness, you must also confront the possibility of regret. And there were regrets. He acknowledged them carefully, like handling fragile glass. Times when exhaustion sharpened his tone, times when ambition pulled him away longer than necessary, times when he dismissed her concern as overthinking. He did not shout, he did not betray. But absence has its own way of wounding. "I didn't always see the weight she was carrying," he admitted softly. "I thought my burdens were heavier." That sentence hung in the air longer than the rest. It takes humility to recognize that you were not the only one struggling, that while you were fighting battles in public, someone else was fighting quieter ones at home. The silence between them was never explosive. It was subtle, accumulated. A missed acknowledgement here, a swallowed apology there, a thank you left unsaid because it felt obvious. Years passed. Children grew. Careers peaked and shifted. And still, certain words remained locked inside him. Why? Because once decades go by without saying something, saying it suddenly feels dramatic, out of character, too late. He feared it might sound theatrical, insincere, as though age had softened him into sentimentality. But age does something else, too. It removes the illusion of infinite time. At 82, the arithmetic changes. You begin to count what remains, not what has passed. You notice how quickly afternoons dissolve into evening, how memories feel closer than tomorrow. He said he woke up one morning recently with an unfamiliar urgency, not panic, but clarity. "What if I leave without saying it?" he asked quietly. "Saying what?" "Thank you. I'm sorry. I see you." Words so simple yet so delayed. He described sitting across from her at breakfast, watching her hands move the way they always had. Steady, efficient, familiar. Hands that had held their children, held him through doubt, held the structure of their life together. And he realized something almost shocking in its simplicity. He had never properly told her how much those hands had steadied him. He smiled when recounting this, not a triumphant smile, but one edged with disbelief at himself. "At 82, he said, I finally understood that strength is not silence. That was the admission, not a grand romantic declaration, not a dramatic confession of hidden passion. Just this, he had mistaken restraint for depth. He had believed that loving quietly was enough. And now, he wasn't so sure. He admitted that there were moments when he had hurt her, not through cruelty, but through omission, through emotional distance, through the stubborn belief that being present physically was equivalent to being present emotionally. "I should have said thank you more," he murmured. "I should have said I was grateful. I should have said I was wrong." There it was, the crescendo not built on scandal but on humility. At 82, he smiled, not because everything was perfect, but because he had finally found the courage to acknowledge what he once avoided. He admitted that the love he carried for her had always been deeper than his words suggested. And then, almost unexpectedly, he said something that lingered long after the conversation ended. "I thought she knew," he said. "But knowing and hearing are not the same." In that quiet room, with the afternoon light thinning toward evening, a man who had spent a lifetime speaking for others finally allowed himself to speak for himself. Not loudly, not theatrically, just honestly. He did not clear his throat before speaking. He did not adjust his posture as if preparing for a performance. If anything, he seemed almost embarrassed by the simplicity of what he was about to say. "It wasn't the big things," he began, voice steady but softer than usual. "It was never the big things." He wasn't talking about sacrifice in the dramatic sense, not about grand gestures or heroic endurance. He didn't frame her as a saint. He didn't frame himself as redeemed. He spoke the way an old man might speak at the end of a long day, carefully, without decoration. She would wait, he said, sometimes with food already cold. She wouldn't complain, she would just warm it again. He paused there, as though that image alone carried more weight than any poetic metaphor could. A plate on a table. Steam rising again. No applause, no audience. "You don't notice it at first," he continued. "You think that's just how life works. You come home, there's food, there's light in the house. You assume it arranged itself." He smiled faintly, almost at his own blindness. But it was her! There was no music swelling in the background, no trembling drama in his voice. Just a simple acknowledgement of something that had been true for decades. He spoke about the way she would reach for his hand in crowded places, not to claim him, not to display affection, but to steady him. A small squeeze before he stepped into a room full of expectation. She didn't say, "You'll be great," he recalled. She just held my hand, and somehow that was enough. It struck him, perhaps too late, that those quiet gestures had been her language of love. While he searched for meaning in scripts and speeches, she built it into routine. He did not describe her as extraordinary in the way magazines describe partners of famous men. He described her as consistent. She was patient, he said. Not the kind of patience you boast about. The kind that just keeps showing up. He mentioned mornings when he left before sunrise, rehearsing lines under his breath. She would stand in the doorway, hair still uncombed, reminding him to drive safely. No fanfare, no dramatic farewell. Just that steady presence. And then he said something that shifted the tone slightly. "I thought I was the one carrying the weight," he admitted. "But she was carrying me." It wasn't said with shame. It was said with recognition. He spoke of arguments too. Not explosive fights, but the quieter kind. The ones that linger in the air longer than they should. Times when he dismissed her concerns because he was tired. Times when he mistook her questions for criticism. "She would let me finish," he said, "even when I was wrong." That detail stayed with him. Not because it made him look better, because it didn't. He acknowledged how often she chose silence. Not the cold kind, but the deliberate kind. The silence that allows the other person to return to themselves. "She had a way of waiting until I came back to my senses," he said, almost amused. Again, nothing dramatic, just truth. He did not speak of love as fireworks. He spoke of it as maintenance, as daily repair, as the act of keeping something intact when it would be easier to let it crack. "There were days I came home defeated," he shared. Not publicly, no one knew. but she could see it. She never interrogated him. She never demanded explanations. She would sit beside him, sometimes not even speaking. Just there. That was her gift, he said. She didn't need to fix me. She just stayed. At 82, he no longer felt the need to impress anyone with elaborate tributes. He did not call her his muse. He did not elevate her into legend. He said simply, "She kept the house warm." And when he said it, you understood he meant more than temperature. He described the way she folded his clothes even when he insisted he could do it himself. The way she remembered which tea he preferred when he couldn't sleep. The way she quietly placed a blanket over him when he fell asleep in a chair. "These are small things," he said, "but they add up." That phrase lingered. They add up. Decades of small gestures accumulating into something larger than any award. He admitted that for years he believed gratitude did not need to be spoken if it was felt. Now he wasn't so certain. "I should have told her," he said quietly. "More often. Not, I loved her. That was assumed. I should have told her I noticed." There was something almost shocking in that admission. That noticing, being seen for the invisible work, is sometimes more powerful than being adored. He did not frame his words as a dramatic apology. He framed them as overdue acknowledgement. "If I have any steadiness," he added, "it's because she steadied me first." And then he leaned back, hands resting on his knees, as if the weight of what he had finally said was both lighter and heavier at the same time. He did not cry. He did not tremble. He did not look for validation. He simply smiled, gently, almost shyly, and said one last thing in that quiet, unadorned tone. It was never about greatness. It was about her being there. No poetry, no embellishment, just the truth of a man who had finally learned that the smallest acts, the reheated meal, the waiting light, the patient silence, were the architecture of everything he had built. And for the first time in decades, he allowed himself to say it out loud. When you are young, love feels urgent. It burns quickly. It demands to be seen. It thrives on intensity. Late-night conversations, grand promises, the belief that emotion alone can carry two people through anything. At 25, love is fire. It is instinct. It is the thrill of being chosen. But at 82, love no longer burns that way. It does not need to. He spoke about this slowly, almost cautiously, as if discovering the thought while saying it. When you're young, he reflected, you love with your pulse. When you're old, you love with your memory. There is something unsettling in that distinction. Youth measures love by feeling. How strongly your heart reacts. How loudly you declare it. How fiercely you defend it. Age measures love differently. By what has endured. By who remained. By what did not break when tested. Time erodes certain illusions. It fades the drama. It softens the urgency. The sharp edges of passion dull into something steadier. The need to be right becomes less important than the need to understand. He admitted that, in his younger years, he believed love was proven by commitment alone. You stayed, you worked, you did not leave. That was the definition. Now, he questions that simplicity. Staying is important, but understanding is deeper. At this stage of life, love is not about intensity. It is about recognition. It is about knowing the way someone breathes when they are worried. Knowing the difference between their silence and their exhaustion. Knowing when not to speak. You stop trying to impress, he said with a faint smile. You start trying to protect. There is a quiet dignity in that shift. Time does take things away. It takes physical strength. It takes speed. It takes the easy confidence of youth. It dims certain excitements. It exposes fragility. It reminds you constantly that nothing is permanent. But time also clarifies It strips away ego. It reveals patterns. It shows you which arguments mattered, and which never did. It exposes how often pride stood in the way of tenderness. In youth, love is about being seen. In age, love becomes about seeing. He reflected on how, decades ago, he assumed his wife understood his devotion without hearing it. He believed consistency spoke louder than words. Perhaps it did. But now, with the distance of years, he sees the gaps. Time has a cruel honesty. It shows you the moments when you could have said something and did not. It shows you the times you chose silence because it felt safer. And yet, it also offers a strange mercy. Because at this age, you no longer perform love. You inhabit it. The gestures become smaller, but more deliberate. A hand resting longer than before. A glance exchanged across a room filled with history. A shared silence that feels complete, not empty. At this age, he said quietly, love is not excitement. It is alignment. That word lingered. Alignment, not fireworks, not spectacle, not declarations shouted from rooftops. Just two people who have adjusted to each other's rhythms over time. Two people who have survived change without dissolving. There is also a humility that arrives with gray hair. Many men, he included, are not taught to speak love fluently. They are taught to demonstrate reliability, to carry weight, to endure without complaint. Words of affection are often reserved for private thought, not public confession. It takes decades, sometimes, for that conditioning to loosen. You realize too late that saying it doesn't make you smaller, he admitted. It makes you human. That realization seems to come most often when time begins to feel finite. It is not uncommon, he suggested gently, for men to reach their 70s or 80s and suddenly find themselves searching for the vocabulary they once dismissed. They look at their wives, at the woman who has shared half a century beside them, and they understand something they could not articulate at 30. At 30, love competes with ambition. At 80, ambition is quiet. What remains is the person who stayed when the world shifted. Time fades certain things, the urgency of desire, the need for constant affirmation, the illusion of invincibility. But time sharpens other truths. It clarifies who mattered. It clarifies which words should have been spoken. It clarifies that love is not measured by how loudly it was declared, but by how consistently it was practiced. He spoke about how age makes you less concerned with being admired and more concerned with being honest. There is a softness that replaces stubbornness, a willingness to admit fault, a desire to leave nothing unsaid. When you're young, he reflected, you think love will always have another chance to be expressed. At 82, he no longer assumes that. He has learned that love in its later years is less about passion and more about presence, less about proving, more about acknowledging, less about excitement, more about gratitude. There is something profoundly moving in watching a man who once carried himself with unshakable composure now speak gently about something as simple as holding hands. Gray hair does not weaken love. It deepens its quiet. And perhaps the most revealing truth of all is this. Many men only begin to say, "I love you," with ease when they realize that time itself is no longer guaranteed. Not because the feeling is new, but because the fear of leaving it unspoken finally outweighs the fear of vulnerability. At 82, love is no longer an emotion that needs display. It is a truth that needs acknowledgement. No one expected it. For decades, he had been steady, composed, almost immovable in the public eye. People admired him for his discipline, his clarity, his control. He was not a man known for sentimental confession. He was known for precision, for gravity, for speaking about history, justice, art. So when he began speaking about something as intimate as gratitude to his wife, something shifted in the room, and beyond it. There was no dramatic gasp, No loud reaction, just a quiet stillness that settled over those listening. The kind of stillness that doesn't come from shock alone, but from recognition. People had come expecting reflection. They had not expected tenderness. At first, there was surprise, a subtle recalibration. Is he really saying this? Is he really admitting that he waited decades to say thank you? But then the surprise softened, because what he described was not scandalous. It was not extraordinary. It was painfully familiar. A reheated meal, a patient silence, a hand held before stepping into uncertainty. These were not celebrity stories. They were ordinary stories. And that was precisely why they moved people. Many listeners, especially men his age, felt something tighten quietly in their chests. Not because his words were dramatic, but because they were delayed. Because they recognized themselves in his hesitation, in his decades of restraint, in the quiet assumption that love did not need to be spoken if it was present. There was warmth in the response, but it was not loud warmth. It was the kind that spreads slowly, the kind that makes someone stare at the floor for a moment longer than usual. Some later admitted that they had not expected to feel emotional. They had attended out of respect, out of curiosity. They left carrying something heavier and lighter at the same time. A woman in her 70s reportedly said, almost under her breath, "We waited a long time to hear that." Not as a criticism, as a release. Because in many long marriages, words of appreciation are assumed but not voiced. Devotion is practiced but not narrated. His confession cracked open that unspoken space. It gave language to something people had lived quietly. There were couples who sat closer that evening. Not dramatically, just slightly. As if the acknowledgement of time made proximity feel more urgent. You could sense a collective reflection unfolding. Not about him alone, but about themselves. How many meals had gone unthanked? How many silent supports had gone unnoticed? How many "I'm proud of you" or "I'm grateful for you" had been swallowed because they felt unnecessary? He had not intended to provoke self-examination. But honesty has a way of doing that. Some younger listeners were struck by something else. The realization that love evolves. That what looks ordinary in the present may one day become sacred in memory. That the smallest gestures accumulate into something monumental over decades. There was no frenzy, no spectacle. Instead, there was a shared exhale. A kind of collective "I understand." Men who had spent years believing that emotional restraint equaled strength began reconsidering that equation. Not loudly, not with declarations, but quietly, inwardly. One could see it in the faces, particularly those lined by time. A certain softening, a certain stillness. His words did not accuse. They did not shame. They did not preach. They invited. They invited people to look at the person beside them and wonder, have I said enough? Have I acknowledged enough? Have I assumed too much? The response was not applause in the usual sense. It was something more subdued, more intimate. After he finished speaking, there was a pause before the room responded. Not because they were uncertain, because they were absorbing. That pause may have been the most telling reaction of all. It wasn't just admiration for a respected figure revealing vulnerability. It was recognition of a shared human pattern, the tendency to postpone tenderness. In that moment, he was no longer just a public figure. He was an aging husband, admitting he had learned something late. And that humility bridged the distance between stage and audience. People did not leave energized. They left thoughtful. Some felt warmth. Others felt a quiet ache. A few likely felt regret. But above all, there was an unexpected sense of comfort. Because if a man of his stature could admit that he had learned to say thank you at 82, then perhaps it was not too late for anyone else. The impact was subtle but profound. Not because he revealed something scandalous, but because he revealed something simple, And simple truths, when spoken honestly, have a way of settling deeply. And in the silence that followed his confession, something unspoken seemed to ripple outward. Maybe love is not diminished by late acknowledgement. Maybe it is strengthened by it. And perhaps, in hearing him finally say it aloud, others began quietly preparing their own words. Words they had been carrying for years, waiting for a moment brave enough to release them. Evening arrives differently at 82. It does not rush in, it settles. The light outside fades without drama, slipping from gold into blue, from blue into something softer and harder to name. The house is quiet now. No interviews, no rehearsals, no distant applause echoing in memory. The day has folded itself neatly away. Inside, there is only a lamp glowing in the corner of the room. He sits beside her, not across from her, not addressing a room full of strangers, not shaping his voice for effect. Just beside her, close enough that their shoulders almost touch. There is no grand conversation unfolding, no carefully constructed confession. The most important words have already been spoken. Or perhaps they no longer need to be. He watches her for a moment, without saying anything. The familiar lines on her face, the way her hands rest in her lap. Hands that have held decades together without ever demanding recognition. Outside, a car passes. Somewhere in the distance, someone laughs. Life continues at its ordinary pace, but inside that small room, time feels condensed. As if 82 years have narrowed themselves down to this single quiet evening. He reaches for her hand, not dramatically, not urgently, slowly, almost thoughtfully, as if rediscovering something he has always known was there. She doesn't look surprised. She turns her hand slightly so their fingers fit together more easily. The gesture is instinctive, practiced, worn smooth by years of repetition. No spotlight catches the moment. No audience leans forward in anticipation. There is no swelling music, just two hands resting together. The stage that once demanded so much of him is nowhere in sight. The noise that once surrounded his name has dissolved into memory. What remains is not performance. It is presence. He glances at her, and there is something in his expression that is neither triumph nor regret. It is quieter than both. Gratitude, perhaps, or recognition. There are still challenges. Age has not erased fragility. Bodies grow slower. Energy thins. Patience is tested in new ways. Love at this stage is not immune to strain. It requires adaptation. It requires gentleness. Nothing is promised. Nothing is declared perfect. The future is not guaranteed to unfold without difficulty. They both know that. Age does not allow illusions to linger. And yet, in that dimly lit room, none of that feels urgent. Because what matters in that moment is not certainty. It is connection. He squeezes her hand slightly, not as reassurance, not as apology, simply as acknowledgement. A silent sentence passing between them. Thank you. For staying, for waiting, for carrying, for forgiving what I did not know how to say. She does not respond with words. She does not need to. The years between them are fluent in silence. The clock on the wall ticks steadily. The sound no longer feels like pressure. It feels like rhythm. He leans back in his chair, still holding her hand. The lamp casts soft shadows along the walls. The world outside remains unaware of the quiet magnitude of this scene. No one is recording it. No one is applauding. There is no script. And perhaps that is what makes it real. 82 years have distilled themselves into this uncomplicated image. An old man and the woman who walked beside him, sitting in the quiet aftermath of a life lived fully and imperfectly. He does not promise her forever. He does not promise ease. He does not speak of flawless devotion. He simply remains. And in remaining, he understands something he once overlooked. That love, in its final chapters, is less about intensity and more about humility. He turns his head slightly toward her, as if to say something more. But instead, he lets the moment stand on its own. The house is still, two hands intertwined. No spotlight, no applause, just the quiet weight of shared years. And perhaps, in that unremarkable evening, there is a truth that lingers longer than any performance ever could. Maybe the hardest thing in life is not finding someone to love, but having the humility to say thank you when you have already walked almost to the end of the road together.